The metal cantina buzzed with quiet conversation as alien soldiers from different worlds shared drinks and war stories. In the corner, an old Altarian warrior named Kethfer sat alone at his table, his 4 muscular arms wrapped around a large mug of blue liquid. His body was covered in scars from countless battles, and his compound eyes held the tired look of someone who had seen too much death. A group of younger soldiers approached his table, their eyes bright with curiosity. They had heard whispers about this veteran, stories about the things he had witnessed during the Great War. The leader of the group was Vextal, a centurion with smooth blue skin that marked him as someone who had never faced real combat. "Elder Kethfer," Vextal said respectfully, "we have heard stories about your time fighting alongside the humans. Is it true what they say about them in battle?" Kethfer looked up slowly, his multiple eyes studying the young faces around him. These soldiers were eager for tales of glory, hungry for stories that would make their hearts race. They had no idea what they were asking for. "Sit down," Kethfer said quietly, his voice rough like grinding stone. "But understand that once I tell you these stories, you cannot unhear them. The things I witnessed will change how you see warfare forever." The young soldiers quickly pulled up chairs, forming a circle around the old veteran. Other conversations in the cantina began to die down as more aliens noticed what was happening. Veterans at nearby tables turned their heads, recognizing something in Kethfer's tone that made them want to listen. "I fought in the Sector 7 war," Kethfer began, taking a long drink from his mug. 2 years of the most brutal fighting the galaxy has ever seen. I served alongside soldiers from every species in the Coalition. Rigelians with their strength, Vexians with their technology, Corvani with their tactical genius. But the humans... It paused, searching for the right words. The humans were different. Not stronger than the Regilans, not smarter than the Vexians, not more skilled than the Corvani. But they had something else, something that made enemy forces flee in terror when they heard humans were coming. A young Rigelian soldier leaned forward eagerly. What made them so special? Were their weapons superior? Kethfer shook his head slowly. Their weapons were standard Coalition issue, same as ours. Their armor was no better, their ships no faster. What made them terrifying was something you cannot buy or build or steal. The cantina had grown completely quiet now. Even the servers had stopped moving, drawn in by the old warrior's words. "During my first battle with humans, I thought I understood warfare," Kethfer continued. "I had fought in dozens of campaigns, earned commendations for bravery, led troops into battle. I believed I knew what courage looked like." He took another drink, his hands trembling slightly. "The humans taught me that I knew nothing. They showed me what real courage means, and it was more terrifying than any enemy weapon I had ever faced." Vextal shifted impatiently. "What did they do? How were they different from other soldiers?" Kethfer's compound eyes focused on something far beyond the cantina walls. Seeing battles that had ended years ago but still raged in his memory, "Other species fight to win," he said quietly. "We calculate odds, weigh risks, make tactical decisions based on logic and survival. We retreat when outnumbered, surrender when defeat is certain, preserve our forces for future battles. This is rational, sensible warfare." He looked around at the young faces surrounding him. "Humans do not fight to win. They fight because giving up is not possible for them. I watched human soldiers continue attacking when they were outnumbered 50 to 1. I saw them charge enemy positions that should have been suicide missions. I witnessed them hold defensive. Lines that every military textbook said could not be held." A Corvani engineer spoke up from a nearby table. "It sounds like poor tactical thinking, unnecessary sacrifice." Kethfer turned to look at him, and something in the old veteran's gaze made the engineer step back. "That is what I thought too. At first, I assumed they were simply reckless, that their commanders did not understand proper military strategy. But as I fought beside them, battle after battle, I began to understand the truth." He stood up slowly, his scarred body casting long shadows in the cantina's dim lighting. They were not reckless. They were not poorly trained. They were something that the rest of us had never encountered in all our centuries of warfare. His voice dropped barely above a whisper. They were absolutely, completely, utterly, unwilling to accept defeat when something important was at stake. The silence in the cantina was so complete that the hum of the life support systems seemed loud. "I will tell you about 3 battles," Kethfer said, settling back into his chair. 3 times when I watched humans do things that should have been impossible. 3 times when they showed me that there are worse things than death. He looked around the circle of eager young faces. The first battle was at Torhan Prime, where 47 human Marines held off an entire siege force for 18 days. The second was at Arcturus Station, where 32 humans survived in conditions that should have killed them in hours, while keeping the rest of us alive too. The third was at Kepler's Gate, where 23 humans held a position against 10,000 enemies because civilian transports needed 14 more hours to evacuate. Vextel's blue skin had paled. Those numbers. They cannot be accurate. Every word is true, Kethfer said grimly. And they are just 3 battles among hundreds. Every coalition veteran who has served with humans has stories like these. Stories that will haunt you for the rest of your life. He picked up his mug again, but his hands were shaking too badly to drink. "Do you still want to hear them?" he asked quietly. "Do you still want to know what I witnessed during those 2 years of fighting alongside the most terrifying species in the galaxy?" The young soldiers nodded eagerly, but Kethfer noticed that the older veterans in the cantina had grown very still, their faces grim with understanding. "Very well," the old Altarian said. "But remember that I warned you. These are not stories of glory or heroism. These are accounts of what happens when an entire species decides that some things are worth any sacrifice." He took a deep breath, gathering the strength to relive memories that had never stopped haunting him. Began at Torhan Prime, during what should have been a simple operation. ... The old Altarian warrior took another sip of his drink before continuing his tale. The young soldiers around him waited with eager faces, but Kethfer could see the doubt in their eyes. They still did not believe what humans were truly capable of. "Torhan Prime started like any other military operation," Kethfer said, his voice carrying the weight of old memories. "The Coalition Command sent us to capture an industrial complex on the planet's surface. It was supposed to take 3 days. At most, we had overwhelming numbers and superior firepower." He gestured with one of his forearms toward the cantina window where stars twinkled in the darkness beyond. 2,000 Coalition soldiers landed on that world. Rigelian warriors, famous for their strength in battle. Vexian artillery teams with weapons that could level city blocks. Corvani engineers who could build fortifications in hours. And 47 human Marines. The young Centurion soldier Vextal frowned. Only 47 humans among 2,000. Troops? They must not have been considered very important. Kethfer's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. "That is what we all thought at first. The human unit was small, quiet, and their equipment looked no different from standard Coalition gear. Their leader was a man named Jack Morrison, middle-aged with gray hair and calm eyes. He spoke little during the briefings. The old veteran paused, remembering the human commander's weathered face. Morrison had a second in command, a woman called Lisa Rodriguez. She was younger than Morrison, but had the same quiet confidence. The other humans in their unit looked ordinary too, nothing special about their appearance or their gear. Kethfer's expression darkened as he continued. The operation went wrong from the very beginning. Enemy forces were waiting for us with prepared positions and heavy weapons. Our orbital support ships were destroyed by hidden anti-aircraft batteries within the first hour. Suddenly, 2,000 Coalition troops were trapped on a hostile world. With no way to escape, he took a long drink before going on. The Rigelian commander immediately called for retreat to defensive positions. The Vexian artillery teams began calculating surrender terms. Even the Corvani engineers started discussing how to negotiate with the enemy for safe passage home. The cantina had grown completely silent again. Other alien soldiers at nearby tables had stopped their conversations to listen to Kethfer's account. But Morrison just looked at the burning city around us and said something I will never forget. Kethfer's voice grew softer. Said 47. "Marines? That should be enough." Vextal's blue skin showed confusion. "Enough for what? To surrender with dignity? Enough to win?" Kethfer replied simply. "While the rest of us were planning retreat or surrender, Morrison was planning victory. The old warrior stood up and began pacing slowly around the table, his scarred body moving with the careful grace of an experienced fighter. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about warfare. The humans did not dig in and wait for rescue. They did not try to negotiate with the enemy. Instead, they went hunting. He stopped pacing and looked directly at the young soldiers. Rodriguez vanished into the ruined city on the second day. For 3 days, enemy commanders started dying one by one, shot from impossible distances by a sniper they could never find. A human named Tom Anderson began setting traps using medical supplies and food rations, turning everyday items into deadly explosives. Cuthbert's voice grew more intense as he continued. The humans did not fight like any other species I had ever seen. They did not mass their forces for direct attacks. Instead, they moved through the city like ghosts, striking without warning, and disappearing before the enemy could respond. A Regellian officer at a nearby table called out, "But what about the rest of the coalition forces? What were we doing during this?" Cuthbert turned to face him. "We were trying to survive." Regellians built barricades and held defensive positions. The Vexians used their remaining heavy weapons to keep enemy forces at bay. The Corvain engineers worked to repair damaged equipment and communications. He sat back down at his table, his compound eyes focusing on the past. But the humans were doing something entirely different. They were taking the war to the enemy, making them afraid to move, afraid to sleep, afraid to give orders. Every day, more enemy soldiers were found dead in their positions. Every night, supply convoys were destroyed by explosions that seemed to come from nowhere. Cuthbert's voice grew quieter as he reached the most difficult part of his story. On the 12th day of the siege, I made a mistake. I was moving between positions when an enemy plasma cannon found me. The blast tore through most of my left side, destroying 2 of my arms and burning deep into my torso. He touched the scars on his carapace, where the old wounds had healed. Our medical team said I would not survive. The damage was too severe, and we had no proper surgical equipment. I was dying, and everyone knew it. Vexta leaned forward, caught up in the story despite himself. But the human medic, Mike Thompson, refused to accept that diagnosis. He was young, maybe 25 standard years, with bright eyes and steady hands. When he heard I was dying, he gathered his medical supplies and prepared to come for me. Cuthbert's mandibles clicked softly. The problem was that I was trapped. In a building surrounded by enemy positions, any rescue attempt would be suicide. The enemy had clear lines of fire from 3 directions, and their weapons could cut down anyone who tried to reach me. He paused, struggling with the memory. Thompson crawled through 6 hours of constant enemy fire to reach my position. 6 hours of plasma bolts and explosive shells moving meter by meter through rubble and debris. When he finally got to me, his armor was melted in places, his equipment was damaged, and he was bleeding from dozens of small wounds. The young soldiers around the table were completely silent now, hanging on every word. And do you know what he did when he saw me lying there, half dead and covered in my own blood? Cuthbert asked quietly. "What?" whispered Vextal. Smiled. This young human, wounded and exhausted from crawling through hell to reach me, looked at my injuries and smiled like he was greeting an old friend. Cuthbert's voice cracked slightly. Then he spent the next 4 hours performing surgery on me. With improvised tools, while Morrison and 2 other Marines held a defensive perimeter around us. Enemy forces attacked constantly, but the humans never wavered. Thompson worked on my wounds while bullets and energy blasts flew over our heads. The old veteran touched his regenerated limbs. When Thompson finished saving my life, he packed up his gear and crawled back out to save other wounded soldiers. He spent that entire night moving between positions, treating injuries and pulling soldiers back from death. Cuthbert looked around at the stunned faces surrounding him. By the 18th day, only 43 humans remained alive. But they had turned Torhan Prime into such a nightmare for the enemy that 3,000 enemy soldiers abandoned the siege and retreated from the planet. The silence in the cantina was absolute. When the relief force finally arrived, they found the humans still at their positions, still ready to fight. Morrison looked at the rescue ships and said, "Good timing. We were just getting started." Cuthbert finished his drink and set the empty mug on the table. That was my first lesson in what humans become when they decide that retreat is not an option. Cuthbert sat quietly for a moment, staring into his now warm drink, as if seeing ghosts in its depths. The memory of the ice world still brought a chill to his scarred body, even in the heated cantina. After Torhan Prime, I thought I understood what humans could do in battle, he said slowly. But Arcturus Station taught me something different. It showed me what they become when the enemy is not other soldiers, but the planet itself. He looked up at the circle of young faces surrounding him, their eyes wide with curiosity and growing respect. Arcturus Station was built on the edge of Corvani space, a small monitoring outpost that watched 4 enemy movements in 3 star systems. The base was not designed for combat. It had basic defensive weapons and a small garrison of mixed coalition forces. Cuthbert's mandibles clicked softly as he remembered. I was assigned there as part of a rotation, along with 50 other non-human soldiers, Rigelians, Vexians, Corvani, and a few other species. The human contingent was small, just 32 Marines led by a woman named Beth Carter. He paused to take a sip of his drink, making a face at the warm liquid. Carter was different from Morrison at Torhan Prime. Where Morrison was quiet and thoughtful, Carter was energetic and always moving. She had bright eyes and a quick smile, and she treated every problem like a puzzle to be solved. The old veteran's expression grew darker. The station's location made it valuable, but also dangerous. The planet had extreme seasonal changes, and winter there lasted for 8 standard months. When the cold season began, temperatures dropped far below what most species could survive. Vextal shifted uncomfortably.
How cold did it get?
Minus 80 degrees Celsius, Cuthbert replied.
Cold enough to freeze most liquids solid in minutes.
Cold enough to kill most coalition species within hours, even with protective gear. He stood and began pacing again, his forearms gesturing as he spoke. The station's heating systems were designed to handle normal cold weather, but not the extreme temperatures of deep winter. When the main heating plant failed during the worst storm of the season, we faced a terrible choice. The cantina had grown quiet again, with aliens at other tables turning to listen to the story. The logical decision was immediate evacuation. Every coalition manual said to abandon positions that could not be maintained safely. The Regilian commander began organizing transport schedules. The Vexian technicians started shutting down non-essential systems to conserve power for the evacuation. Cuthbert stopped pacing and looked directly at his audience. But Carter stood up in that emergency meeting, ice crystals forming in the air, from her breath, and said something that changed everything. She said this position monitors 3 star systems. If we abandon it, enemy forces could move through this sector undetected and attack civilian colonies. He sat back down, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's lights. The Corvani tactical officer pointed out that staying would mean certain death. Our backup heating could not last more than a few days. Supply ships could not reach us through the ice storms that would last for weeks. Cuthbert's voice grew softer. Carter listened to all the logical arguments, then said, "My people will hold this station. Anyone who wants to evacuate can go with the next transport. We understand the risks." A young Rigelian soldier at a nearby table called out, "What did the other species do?" Most of us prepared to evacuate, Cuthbert admitted. It was the sensible choice. But some of us decided to stay and help the humans, even though we knew it might mean death. He touched his scarred carapace. I stayed because Thompson had saved my life at Torhan Prime. I felt I owed the humans my loyalty. A few Vexians stayed, because their technical skills were needed. Some Corvani remained because they were curious to see what the humans would do. Cuthbert's mandibles clicked in what might have been admiration. What the humans did next was beyond anything I could have imagined. While the rest of us were calculating survival odds and rationing supplies, they began transforming the station into something that could sustain life in impossible conditions. He leaned forward, his voice becoming more intense. David Wilson was a human engineer who had been maintaining the station's communication systems. When he learned that our Vexian communications officer would die without additional heating, Wilson did something incredible. The old veteran paused for effect. removed the heating unit from his own survival suit, and installed it in the Vexian's quarters. Wilson spent the next 6 weeks living in temperatures that should have killed him within hours, keeping warm with nothing but salvaged insulation and his own body heat. Bextall looked shocked, but humans are not adapted for extreme cold. Did he survive? That is exactly what I asked Wilson when I found him building a shelter from scrap metal and emergency blankets. Kethver replied. He looked at me with frost covering his eyebrows and said, "My people survived ice ages on Earth. This is just another winter." The old warrior's voice carried a note of wonder. Jennifer Hayes was another human who did impossible things during those weeks. She organized hunting parties to catch the native ice crawlers that lived in the planet's frozen caves. These creatures were the only source of fresh food available during winter. He shook his head in amazement. Hayes led these hunting expeditions in conditions that made our environmental suits malfunction from the cold, used modified emergency gear and improvised weapons, bringing back enough food to keep the entire remaining garrison fed. Kethver stood again, pacing more slowly this time. But the most incredible human was Robert Clark, a young engineer who volunteered to maintain the station's critical systems. When our heating fuel began running dangerously low, Clark made a decision that still haunts my dreams. The cantina was completely silent now, every alien focused on the veteran's words. Clark removed the heating elements from his own survival suit and installed them in the main computer systems. He knew this meant he would slowly freeze to death, but he said the station's sensors had to keep working to protect those civilian colonies. Kethver's voice cracked slightly. For 3 weeks, I watched Clark work at his post, while his body temperature dropped day by day. His hands became so cold, he could barely operate the controls. But he never stopped monitoring the sensors and maintaining the equipment. He sat back down heavily. On the last day before the relief ships arrived, I found Clark at his station. He had died sometime during the night, but he was still sitting upright at his controls. The equipment was running perfectly, and the sensor logs showed he had continued working until his final moments. The silence stretched for long minutes. All 32 humans survived until the relief force reached us. Kethver continued quietly. Well, 31 survived. Clark gave his life to keep the station operational. But because of their sacrifices, the rest of us lived through 2 months of conditions that should have been impossible to survive. He looked around at the stunned faces surrounding him. The humans did not just save themselves. They saved every non-human who stayed with them, sharing their warmth, their food, their equipment. It's their very life force to keep us alive. Kethver finished the last drops of his warm drink. When the rescue ships finally arrived, Carter greeted them with the same bright smile she had always worn, as if spending 2 months slowly freezing to death was just another day's work. The old veteran's compound eyes grew distant. That was when I began to understand that humans do not just refuse to surrender in battle, they refuse to surrender to anything, even death itself, when others are depending on them. Kethver's forearms trembled as he gripped his drink, and the young soldiers around him noticed how the old warrior suddenly looked much older. The scars on his carapace seemed deeper in the dim cantina light, and his compound eyes held a darkness that made them uncomfortable. "Kepler's Gate," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I live for 1,000 more years, I will never forget what I saw there." He set down his drink with shaking hands and stared at the table for a long moment before continuing. Kepler's Gate was not just another military outpost. It was the most important strategic position in 3 sectors of space. The hyperspace junction there controlled all faster-than-light travel between the Corvani system and the outer colonies. Kethver looked up at the circle of young faces, seeing their confusion. "Imagine a bridge over a vast river," he explained. "If you control the bridge, you control who can cross the river." Kepler's Gate was that bridge, but for spaceships traveling between star systems. The old veteran's mandibles clicked nervously. The enemy knew how important the gate was. If they could capture it, they could cut off the Corvani homeworld from all outside help. Millions of civilians would be trapped with no way to escape or receive supplies. He began pacing around the table again, his movements more agitated than before. Coalition Command sent 200 soldiers to defend the gate. It seemed like enough at the time. We had defensive positions, heavy weapons, and early warning systems. The intelligence report said any enemy attack would be small and quick. Kethver stopped pacing and turned to face his audience. The intelligence reports were wrong. When the enemy fleet arrived, our sensors counted over 50 ships carrying 10,000 assault troops. We were outnumbered 50-1. The numbers hung in the air like a death sentence. Even the youngest soldiers could understand what those odds meant. The enemy's strategy was simple, Kethver continued. Overwhelm our defenses with massive numbers, capture the gate quickly, and then use it to launch attacks deeper into coalition space. He sat back down heavily, his scarred body showing the weight of memory. As soon as our commanders saw the size of the enemy force, they began implementing standard defensive doctrine. Regellian heavy infantry fell back to inner defensive positions. The Vexian artillery teams repositioned to cover evacuation routes. The Corvani engineers started preparing charges to destroy the gate if capture seemed certain. Kethver's voice grew quieter. Everyone was following proper military procedure. Preserve your forces, trade space for time, conduct fighting withdrawals to save as many soldiers as possible. It was logical, sensible, and completely correct according to every tactical manual. He looked directly at Vextal. Everyone except the humans, 23 Marines under the command of a man named James Parker. When the order came to fall back to secondary positions, Parker did something that defied all military logic. The old veteran's compound eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the cantina walls. Parker was looking at a tactical display, showing civilian transport ships still loading evacuees from nearby colonies. 15,000 people who needed 14 more hours to reach safety. He studied the display for a moment, then turned to his Marines and said, "Not one step back." Vextal frowned. What did he mean? He meant exactly what he said, Kethver replied. Parker and his 23 Marines would hold the primary defensive line. They would not retreat 1 meter while those civilian ships were still in danger. The cantina had grown completely silent. Even the servers had stopped moving, drawn in by the impossible story. The other coalition commanders tried to reason with Parker. Kethver continued. The Regellian colonel explained that 23 soldiers could not hold a line designed for 2,000. The Vexian tactical officer showed calculations proving the position would be overrun in less than an hour. He paused, remembering. Parker listened to all their arguments, then said something I will never forget. He said, "Those are civilian. Families trying to escape. My Marines and I did not join the coalition to abandon innocent people. We will hold this line until every transport is safely away." Kethver's voice cracked slightly. The battle began at dawn. Damn, 10,000 enemy soldiers. Attacked positions, defended by 23 humans. I watched from the secondary defensive line as those Marines opened fire with everything they had. He stood up again, his movements sharp with remembered tension. For the first hour, the human weapons fire was so intense that the enemy advance stopped completely. Parker had positioned his Marines perfectly, using overlapping fields of fire to create killing zones that no enemy could cross. The old warrior's mandibles clicked rapidly, but ammunition does not last forever. After 6 hours of constant fighting, the humans began running out of bullets for their rifles and power cells for their energy weapons. He looked around at the stunned faces surrounding him. Any other species would have retreated at that point. Running out of ammunition means the battle is over. But the humans did not see it that way. Kethver's voice grew more intense. A human named Mark Stevens began making explosives from power cells and food rations. He taught the other Marines how to turn everyday supplies into bombs. When the enemy tried to advance, they found the ground in front of the human positions filled with improvised mines. The old veteran sat back down, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's lights. When those explosives ran out, a woman named Carol Nelson organized hand-to-hand combat charges. She led groups of Marines in attacks using nothing but combat knives and clubs made from broken equipment. He paused, struggling with the memory. I watched Nelson lead 5 Marines in a charge against 50 enemy soldiers. They had no guns, no Explosives, just cold steel and determination. They broke the enemy formation and drove them back, then returned to their defensive positions to wait for the next attack. Kethfer's voice grew quieter. Parker, their commander, continued fighting. Even after an enemy explosive broke his left arm, an internal bleeding made him cough up blood. When his rifle was destroyed by shrapnel, he used the broken pieces as clubs. When his Marines began falling wounded or dead, he moved to cover their positions by himself. The silence in the cantina was so complete that the hum of life support systems seemed loud. The final hour, only 7 humans remained alive. Parker, Nelson, and 5 others, including a young Marine named Ryan Foster who could not have been more than 20 years old. Kethfer's mandibles clicked in something that might have been awe or horror. 7 humans against thousands of enemy soldiers. Any rational beings would have surrendered or retreated. The battle was clearly lost. But those 7 Marines formed a circle and prepared to fight until the end. He looked around at the young soldiers listening to his story. They fought like nothing I had ever seen before, like demons from the old stories, like forces of nature that could not be stopped or reasoned with. Enemy soldiers fell back in terror at the sight of these 7 humans who simply would not die. Kethfer's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. For 14 hours, those 23 Marines held a defensive line that should have required 2,000 soldiers. When the civilian transports finally reached safety and sent the all-clear signal, only 3 humans were still alive. He finished his drink in one long swallow. Parker, Nelson, and Foster. Boss. All 3 so badly wounded that our medics said they should have died hours earlier, but they had held the line. 15,000 civilians lived because 23 humans decided that some things are worth any sacrifice. The old veteran set down his empty mug and looked around at the stunned faces surrounding him. That was the day I learned what humans truly become when everything else is stripped away. They become something beyond courage, beyond heroism, beyond anything the rest of us can understand. The cantina fell into a heavy silence after. Kethfer finished telling about the battle at Kepler's Gate. The old Altarian warrior sat bent over his empty drink, his forearms shaking slightly. Young soldiers around him could see that the trembling was not from old age, but from the terrible weight of memories that would never leave him. For several long minutes, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the life support systems and the distant murmur of conversations. From other parts of the space station, the young faces around Kethfer's table showed shock, disbelief, and a growing understanding of something they had never imagined before. Finally, Vextel, the young centurion with bright blue skin, found his voice. It came out as barely more than a whisper. Older Kethfer, those stories you told us, ... Are they really true? Did all of that actually happen? Kethfer slowly raised his compound eyes to look at the young soldier. In those alien eyes, Vextel could see depths of experience and pain that made him want to look away. The old veteran's voice was quiet but steady when he answered, "Every single word is true. And what I told you tonight represents only 3 battles out of hundreds that I witnessed during the war. Every coalition soldier who has ever served alongside humans has similar stories. We all carry these memories, as if summoned by Kethfer's words. An older Rigelian officer from a nearby table stood up and walked over to them. His armor bore the marks of many campaigns, and his face showed the same haunted expression that Kethfer wore. "I was at the second battle of Proxima," the Rigelian said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the silent cantina. 40 human soldiers held defensive positions against 3 full enemy divisions for 8 days straight. When our reinforcement fleet finally broke through the blockade, we found the humans still at their posts, still fighting. He paused, his hands clenching into fists. Only 6 humans were still alive when we reached them, 6 out of 40. But they had held the line. For over a week against impossible odds, the enemy had given up trying to take the position and was preparing to retreat when we arrived. From across the cantina, another voice joined the conversation. A Vexian engineer with cybernetic implants on her head spoke up from her table. "Meridian. Colony," she said simply. 12 human Marines were assigned to protect civilian evacuees during an orbital bombardment. 4,000 families trying to escape to transport ships. The humans had no air support, no heavy weapons, no backup. Just basic rifles and their determination. She stood up and walked closer, her artificial eye glowing softly in the dim light. For 6 hours, those 12 Marines held evacuation points. While enemy ships dropped bombs from orbit, every building around them was destroyed. The ground was torn apart by explosions. But not one civilian was lost. Not one. One by one, other veterans throughout the cantina began sharing their own experiences with human forces. A Corvani pilot told about human fighters who continued attacking enemy ships even after their weapon systems failed. A young Altarian, Memetic, described watching human soldiers give their own medical supplies to wounded aliens, then fight on while bleeding from untreated injuries. Each story followed the same impossible pattern. Humans facing overwhelming odds, impossible situations, certain death. And each time, the humans found a way to succeed through sheer refusal to accept defeat. Kethfer listened to every account, nodding his head grimly as each veteran shared their memories. When the last story was finished, he looked around at the young soldiers who had originally asked to hear about humans in combat. "Do you understand now?" he asked them. "This is why humans are feared throughout the galaxy. Because they are physically stronger than other species. They are not. Not because they have better technology or superior weapons. They do not." He stood up slowly, his scarred body moving with the careful grace of an old warrior. Humans are feared because they fight as if the concept of losing does not exist in their minds. Other species fight to achieve victory. Humans fight because surrender is literally impossible for them to consider when others are depending on them. Bextal looked shaken by everything he had heard. His blue skin had gone pale, and his hands trembled as he spoke. But how do they do it? What makes humans so different from the rest of us? How can they ignore fear and pain and logic? Kethfer considered the question carefully. It was something he had thought about for years, studying human behavior and trying to understand what he had witnessed. "I have spent a long time researching human history and psychology," he said finally. "I think the answer lies in their homeworld. Earth is what we call a death world. For millions of years, everything on that planet was trying to kill them." He gestured toward the cantina window, where stars twinkled in the darkness beyond. Constant. Predators, natural disasters, diseases, extreme weather, volcanic eruptions, ice ages. Most species would have died out or fled to safer worlds. But humans adapted by developing something unique. The old veteran's mandibles clicked softly. They evolved the ability to refuse surrender even when surrender would be logical. For millions of years, any human ancestor who gave up when things became difficult died without having children. Only the ones who absolutely refused to quit survived long enough to pass on their genes. The Regiline officer nodded thoughtfully. "So it is evolution? Genetic programming?" "More than that," Kethfer replied. "It has become part of their fundamental nature. They do not just refuse to surrender. They cannot conceive of surrender as an option when something important is at stake." His voice grew softer, taking on a tone of something like reverence. "I have seen wounded humans continue fighting, when their bodies should have shut down from blood loss and pain. I have watched them perform acts of courage that defied all logic, not because they felt no fear, but because they were more afraid of failing their comrades than of dying." Kethfer began walking toward the cantina exit, then stopped and turned back to face the assembled soldiers. "There is something else you need to understand. Something I learned during 2 years of fighting alongside humans." His voice carried a note of deep respect. "They do not just refuse to abandon their missions. They refuse to abandon each other. If you earn their trust, if you prove yourself worthy by fighting beside them, they will refuse to abandon you too." He touched the scar on his carapace where Mike Thompson had saved his life during the siege of Torhan Prime. "Still have nightmares," he admitted quietly. "But they are not about enemy soldiers or the battles we fought. My nightmares are about the humans themselves, about watching beings willingly sacrifice everything for others, about witnessing courage so complete and absolute that it changed everything I thought I knew about what intelligent life could become. Kethfer looked around the silent cantina one final time, his compound eyes taking in every face that had listened to his stories. The galaxy calls them Death Worlders and fears them as warriors, but I know what they really are. He paused at the threshold, his voice carrying clearly through the still air. They are the species that looked at an uncaring universe full of things trying to destroy them and decided to care anyway. They are the beings who chose to protect others even when protection seemed impossible. The old veteran stepped through the doorway into the corridor beyond. His final words drifted back to the stunned assembly. That is what makes them terrifying, and that is what makes them beautiful. As the cantina door closed behind Kethfer, the soldiers sat in contemplative silence. The stories they had heard would stay with them forever, changing how they thought about courage, sacrifice, and what it meant to never give up. Outside, among the countless stars, human ships continued their patrols through space, carrying crews who would never surrender, never retreat, never abandon those who counted on them for protection. In the vast darkness of the universe, that made all the difference.